While the focus of this channel is verbal communication and framing, we cannot ignore the story that nonverbals can tell us, especially since much of what we hide from others is clear to those who can recognize nonverbal communication. So, an important story is subcommunicated here in this interview with Robert Downey Jr.'s body language. In the beginning of the interview, not super eventful, but I want you to see the baseline in Robert's body language so that you can notice how dramatic the shift is later on when being challenged by the interviewer.
A worthy companion to Avengers, and in some ways a better film, in that it takes the conventions and it twists and retwists them in a way that's kind of clever. Just as an audience member, I'm like, oh, that's really cool. I appreciate the kind of complexity of it.
And what do you think of the obvious parallels being made between you and Iron Man?
At this point, it's natural, but if you'd asked me in the first Iron Man, I'd be like, that's me. And now I'm realizing, I've realized that, of course it's not, I'm not saying that I'm such a fantasist that I felt like I was Tony Stark, but I felt like it was my persona. But none of us are personas.
But he's becoming a much more likable character as well, isn't he?
I suppose
a better
so.
man.
Yeah, he's becoming a better guy.
In a way that you are as well, I suppose.
Sure.
So here the interviewer starts to draw some correlations between Robert Downey Jr. and his character in a pretty friendly way. He's pointing out the positive aspects of Tony Stark that are related to Robert Downey Jr. So when he asked the question earlier and he said, what about the obvious parallels with you? You'll notice, see if I can bring it back up.
I'm not saying that I'm such a fantasist. That's me. And now I'm realizing.
Between you and Iron Man.
Right there. So you see the narrowing of the eyebrows when he says you. And maybe this is because of a hypersensitivity towards interviewers, getting personal with interviews.
It's natural, but if you'd asked me in the first Iron Man, I'd be like, that's me.
So I'd really like to ask you about a quote.
I'm a better guy.
In a way that you are as well, I suppose.
Sure.
Now here, I want you to see the incongruence in the body language here. So he's communicating one thing verbally and another thing with his body language.
Character as well.
He's saying sure, but he's shaking his head no.
Yeah, he's becoming a better guy.
In a way that you are as well, I suppose.
Sure.
Right there, shaking his head no. Now look at this smile here. So he's looking a little bit. Well, he's got the big smile, but it's not really a sincere smile. And you see how he's looking a little bit almost angry if you cover up just the mouth part, right? So you can see that he's not really too happy with the interviewer right at this point, but he's still keeping the diplomacy up in the facade.
I mean, what I'd really like to ask you about a quote you gave to the New York.
And also you see how quickly the smile drops off of his face.
In a way that
that
you
can
are
sometimes
as well.
be a signal that
Sure.
somebody is insincerely smiling when it immediately drops from their face.
I'd really like to ask you about
Watch
a
this.
quote you gave to the New York
Right there.
Times. And I don't want to pry, so if you don't want to talk about it, that's fine. But
He's looking
what
to
you
the
said
left.
New York
He
Times
seems
was
his body language is picking
it
up.
was
He
about-
almost
it
seems
was
a little
after
bit
your
panicked. I don't know if
incarceration,
he's
and you
looking at the
said-
clock or what.
you can't go from a $2,000 a night hotel suite to a penitentiary and understand it and come out a liberal. And I just wondered what you meant by that.
Well, the funny thing is, and I appreciate your point of view, things that you said 5-7 years ago or things you said in an interview that made sense to you at the time, I could pick that apart for 2 hours and be no closer to the truth than I'd be giving you some half-assed answer right now. I couldn't even really tell you what a liberal is. So,
Okay, so I want you to pay attention to Robert's use of vagueness with his answers. So he was asked about a very specific instance, a very specific quote, and instead of referring to that specific quote, he says, well, it's difficult for you to remember, not for me. Like he didn't say, I'm having trouble remembering. He says it's difficult for you to remember, the implication being that people have difficulty remembering things. So pay attention to when people, like if you ask somebody about a specific instance and they do appeal to some broader level conversation about the way humans store information, this is sometimes diffusion of personal responsibility. So he's saying, well, you know how people are. People can be forgetful. Now, this isn't always malicious, but it can be, right? So in certain circumstances, you want to be vague. If somebody asks you something that's very personal and you don't feel that you owe them that information, then it's okay to respond vaguely, but it can also be part of deception, right? So, and then he also goes on to talk about, I'm not even sure I know how to define a liberal, even though he's the one who used the term. So I think it would be pretty easy to understand what that term meant, if he could remember what it meant 5 years ago. But it's vagueness being applied here. And that's okay, because he probably doesn't want to get into a conversation about politics when he's promoting a movie.
Therein lies the answer to your question.
But the statement sort of stands by itself, doesn't it? I mean, does that mean you're not a liberal, or that you came out of prison not being a liberal?
Are we promoting a movie? To me, the thing is that it's...
So he says, are we promoting a movie? So he's still hanging on to the facade and the diplomacy here. He feels the pressure, but he's still not sure if he wants to kind of proceed forward or accuse the interviewer of being potentially abusive here. But one of the important things here to note is there's a critical juncture in communication and conflict. When we're talking about covert communication, it's that moment where we decide to let the other person know we know what's going on here. And I consider it a critical juncture because if you do it too soon, then you can be framed as being a little bit crazy or thinking ill of somebody who really had no bad intention. If you do it too late, then you end up getting kind of bullied into a corner here or engaging in topics that are very uncomfortable. Now, there are some other strategies to avoid uncomfortable topics here, but it's very important, I think, to be able to go in and out of covert and overt strategies to deal with these types of conflicts. So you should be able to do it diplomatically or aggressively. When we look at the Quentin Tarantino breakdown on this channel, he does it very aggressively, so you can see an example of how he handles it there. But Robert's still holding on to that positivity a little bit.
I'm certainly not going to backpedal on anything I've said, but I wouldn't say I'm a Republican or a liberal or a Democrat. I think when I was talking to the person who was doing the interview that day, and that just happened to be my opinion. That's the nice thing, is you can have opinions and they kind of change and flow.
Yeah, well, that's life and that's growing older, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, you say we're promoting an interview. I mean, promoting the movie. I mean, obviously you're doing a promotional round of interviews, and that's why we're talking about the movie. But we also would like to talk a little bit about you, and I don't know how comfortable you are, talking about.
So I wanted you to listen to this part again. So this is where he sort of pre-handles and pre-frames the following questions, and so you see that he's about to transition off the friendlier topics onto the more sensational topics about Robert Downey Jr.'s dark history and his incarceration and things like that. So just wanted you to pay attention to how he pre-handles this. See if it sounds very sincere.
Flow.
Yeah, well, that's life and that's growing older, I suppose, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, you say we're promoting an interview. I mean, promoting the movie. I mean, obviously you're doing a promotional round of interviews, and that's why we're talking about the movie. But we also would like to talk a little bit about you, and I don't know how comfortable you are, talking about yourself at the moment.
You have as much time as anyone else will.
Yeah, well, okay, well then let me just ask you a few more questions, and you can answer them if you want to, and not if you don't want to. I mean, well, I think we've got 3 more minutes on our agreement.
Your foot's starting to jump a little bit. You better get to your next question.
Okay, so this is what I wanted to point out. This is that critical juncture where he starts to go from the covert to the overt. He lets the interviewer know, hey, I'm aware of your body language. I see what's going on here. And if you look at the look in his eye right now, does that seem like a friendly look? Or does it seem like he's about to smash somebody's head with a rock? Well, he's at this point letting him know he knows what's going on. And this is his way of showing his claws a bit. He's saying, look, I've been diplomatic, I've been friendly, but I'm more than comfortable to go there if you want to go there.
You, The reason I'm asking about the past is that you've talked in other interviews again about your relationship with your father and the role of all of that in.
Notice his chest is heaving. It's been doing so for like the last, minute of this interview.
Uh, the dark periods you entered and taking drugs and drinking and all of that. And I just wondered whether, you think you're free of all of that, or whether that's still something.
I'm sorry, I really don't. What are we doing?
Well, I'm just asking questions. That's all.
Right.
I mean,
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
are you? I'm sorry.
Take your mic.
Okay, so here's an interesting thing that the guy says. The interviewer says, I'm just asking questions as a defense for the particular type of questions he was asking, right? So, like in the other breakdowns on the channel here with celebrities storming out of interviews, you will see that the interviewer will say, well, I'm just asking questions, or I'm just doing my job as an interviewer. Or they'll accuse them of objecting to the general use of questions during the interview, when in fact the obvious issue is with the particular types of questions they were being asked. So it's not that he has an issue with general questions, it's those questions. So this can be a manipulative kind of languaging when we accuse the person of opposing a more general, I guess, or lodging a more general complaint about questions, when in reality we know that it was the particular types of questions we asked. And I feel like the metaphor here would be like you're driving 120 miles an hour in a school zone and the cop pulls you over and you tell the cop, what is the issue? I was just driving. Do you have a problem with somebody driving? Well, no. Obviously, it's the particular type of driving that one is doing. So just pay attention to that. People will often try and make it seem as though you're attacking them for the role they're playing or for asking questions, and they attempt to appear sincere when in reality they know, right? They know what types of questions spawned it. Of course this guy knows what types of questions that he was asking and why it got that result, right? So what can we learn from this situation? Well, I think things went off the rails for Robert because he was unable to stay centered here, and understandably so. Like, I think we all have aspects of ourselves where we have insecurities that can be exploited. Maybe somebody insults someone you love, or brings up something upsetting from your past, and when that happens, it can be very difficult to fake diplomacy. The social mask can fall off quickly. So, as far as the interviewer, if his goal was to continue the interview for as long as possible, he did poorly. Maybe his goal was to get, Robert angry in this clip. I don't know. But what he could have done was done a better job of pre-framing his entry into the personal topics by giving Robert a sincere out, right? So something to keep in mind is if you dig into somebody with, let's say you're taking things in a very personal direction. This could be you start to get to the closing part of a sale. Very intense situation for somebody to have pressure applied to them in a selling context. Or maybe it's a therapeutic context, or you're having a heart-to-heart with a friend and you have to bring up something very tough. It helps to raise the rapport level you have with that person in proportion to the pressure that you're about to apply on them. So if he had built the rapport throughout the interview a little bit better, it's possible that Robert would have seen or read into his behavior a little bit more positively and read into it a little bit more charitably. Still, maybe not. He still might have ran out of the interview. But what this could have sounded like, or what the interviewer could have done to build more rapport, was do what I call installing a panic button, right? So I heard about this dentist who had a panic button on this chair, and all the panic button would do is cause a little light to shine. And the panic button was there so that people that were afraid of the dental visit could push that button if they ever felt afraid. Well, the irony is that nobody really pushed it, or very rarely did they ever push it, because there really wasn't any pain in the treatment that he was offering. But just having that panic button there allowed the person to know that they were comfortable and they were safe. Well, you can use that in your rapport building in your conversations as well. If you know you're about to enter something that's kind of a sticky situation, give that person an out, and not just an out that is something that will allow them to save face. So the way he framed it earlier in the conversation is, well, I don't know if you want to talk about this stuff. And I think it was implied that, like, if you don't, you're being evasive. I think that's the feeling that I got from that. It's like, hey, we're about to go here. It's personal. Yes, I'm going to say, yeah, if you don't want to talk about it, we don't have to. But he didn't really clearly communicate that Robert was in control of the situation and that he should be at ease. So something alternative might be to say, that's just a little bit better, would be to say, Robert, I would like to promote your movie, like you said, and I also would like to know if I can ask you a few questions about your experience. But if anything I ask is personal or impolite, please let me know. Would that be okay with you? Right? And so putting that control back in Robert's hands, especially when he was exhibiting all the fidgeting and sort of nervous body language, I think that may have been helpful in this situation. So the next thing he could have done was asked about the dark periods in the past for Robert, but not from the perspective of, are you free of that? And there's a very strong implication there that there's something about Robert's past that is haunting him, or something that he can't get away from, which is the worst type of framing you can ask somebody who's been nice enough to give you an interview, who's had a past of being incarcerated, but had this amazing journey back to success. So I know that he wants a sensational interview, but the way that he framed that question was not a good framing of the question. So alternatively, I think the angle to pick here, if he wanted to go into those darker realms, would be to ask about a learning experience, or in some way that experience shaped the roles that he's able to play, or if it brought something very powerful, or perhaps do you have a message of inspiration for people that you can bring to them. Now from there, he could have transitioned a little bit easier into the darker realms, having demonstrated some goodwill towards Robert and sort of given him an opportunity to speak in a positive light about those otherwise negative experiences. So these are some strategies that you can bring from our experience of learning here into the real world. I've given you a little bit of rapport building strategies here that are hopefully helpful. And if you found this to be helpful, please like and subscribe.